Welcome to the online lectures for information security. In the previous class, we have studied risk identification. In today's class, we'll be beginning with risk assessment. I've also already given an overview of what risk assessment is. Now, within the previous risk identification, we have studied what can be the different assets of an organization, what are the different threats, and what are the different vulnerabilities that are associated with each threat. Now, as we know what are the different assets, we know what are the threats, and we know what are the different vulnerabilities. Now, based on this, we can go for risk assessment. Now, with risk assessment, now we can evaluate the risk for each vulnerability. That is how much risk is associated with each vulnerability that can be identified. So, risk assessment, it evaluates the relative risk for each vulnerability. Now, for doing so, what are you going to do? Within risk assessment, we assign a risk rating or score to each information asset. Now, if suppose there's a specific information asset, you might have some specific data A. Now, this data A is going to have a risk rating. That is how much is it susceptible to risk, how much damage it can make. That you're going to give within some percentage value. That is risk assessment. You are basically evaluating how much risk is associated with each particular asset. Now, within risk assessment, what is risk? Risk is the likelihood of the occurrence of a vulnerability. Now, you might be wondering what is likelihood. Now, likelihood, it can be said as it is a probability that a specific vulnerability will be object of a successful attack. Now what is a vulnerability? A specific vulnerability, it is basically a weakness in a specific program. Now this specific weakness, this vulnerability, or you can say this particular uh, loophole vulnerability, it can be taken as a loophole. So what is the probability that this specific vulnerability is going to be the object of an attack? That is, what are the chances that this specific weakness only will be exploited? So risk is the likelihood of the occurrence of a vulnerability. Now, how are we going to identify whether the this specific weakness is going to be the object of the attack? This can be done by giving some numeric values to risks. We give numeric value. Now this numeric value, it can be either 0 0.1, 0 0.1 means low, or it can be 1.0, that is high. So this is going to be the first point, that is risk is the likelihood of the occurrence of a vulnerability. Then this risk is going to be identified by this. You're going to take this risk number and then you're going to multiply it with what? The value of the information asset, how valuable a specific information asset is, the priority. Then you're going to minus it with the percentage of risk mitigated by current controls. Mitigated means that are removed. That is, if suppose you might your system, whenever you attach a USB drive to your system, you can have some specific threat to your information. So you're installing a specific antivirus. So how much risk is being eliminated by making use of that antivirus? That antivirus is called as your current control, what you're implementing. So with this, you identify the different controls that are minimizing the risk. Then you're going to add it with the uncertainty of current knowledge of the vulnerability. What is the, like, how much doubt you have, how much you are not sure for that particular information, you do not have some correct information. By this, you can identify what is risk by taking the likelihood of a vulnerability, multiplying with the value of the information asset, minus the risk mitigated, and then you're going to add the uncertainty of current knowledge of the vulnerability. That is assume that you might not have some specific information that how much risk can be eliminated by adding some specific control. So that knowledge is not known, so you're going to add that percentage of info of risk within the formula. So by this you identify the risk. Now by making use of this thing, you're going to determine the risk. This is called as your risk determination. Then the next part of this is identifying the possible controls. Now, what are the different controls that can be put in place to reduce the risk? So within this, identifying the for each specific threat and its associated vulnerability. There are different types of threats, and each threat is going to have its own vulnerability that is going to be identified, that have residual risk. Now, what is this residual risk? This residual risk, it is a risk that is still remaining even after you apply some specific control by making use of your existing controls. That is called as your residual risk. So when you identify what are the different threats and vulnerabilities that are associated with that, you're going to get the residual risk. So when you get to know this residual risk, you're going to make a preliminary list of controls that are created. That is, you're going to make some specific controls that you're going to assign to each and every person within your organization. Now, these access controls are of three types: mandatory access controls, non-discretionary access controls, and discretionary access controls. Now, this mandatory access control, this is also called as your MAC. Now, this mandatory access control, this is a type of structured data and this data is coordinated with data classification. Now this data classification, in this data classification, you're going to classify data based upon sensitive levels. Now what is the sensitive levels? These sensitive levels are going to indicate you how confidential the data is. That is called as your mandatory access controls. The next one is non-discretionary access controls. Now within this non-discretionary access control, these are the controls that are going to be managed by a central authority. Now the central authority, this can be either in an organization or you can also give individual roles. So this non-discretionary, it can be of two types, either a role-based control or it can be a task-based control. Now within this role-based controls and task-based controls, what happens is that by whenever you're constantly assigning and revoking privileges from different individuals, it becomes very difficult to administer who is given access control or who is not given access control with specific employee. So what you do within this non-discretionary access control is that you give controls to these two features: role-based control and task-based control. Whenever a specific individual, or you can say a specific employee, is given a task to perform, he's either going to be assigned a role-based control or a task-based control. When he's associated with this, he's going to get all the rights to access the data. When the job is completed, that rights are going to be removed from that individual. So this is going to make the job easy. Now this non-discretionary access control, this is important for 2 marks also. Then comes the discretionary access control. Now this discretionary access control, this is also called as your DAC. Now the first one was also called as MAC also. Now this discretionary access control, this discretionary access control or the DAC, it is going to give the ability to share resources. That is, suppose you've got some information, some file that you have created, with whom you want to share your file, or you do not want to share your file with anyone. So this discretionary, it is going to give the ability to share the resources so that you can give control, and you can also provide access to information. Now, giving control means you can either add, delete, or manipulate information, or you can give access rights completely. You can now give either read only rights, or write only rights, or read write rights. This all can be given. So these control rights and this access rights, these are provided based upon the whatever information you have or whatever resource you have. So these are the three types of access controls. This can be also asked in short answers, the three controls. Then the next one is documenting the final result of risk assessment. Now within risk assessment, you know what are the different risks, what are the threats that have been associated with different vulnerabilities. You've calculated the risk based upon the likelihood, based upon the formula. You're going to calculate the risk with the likelihood of vulnerability. You're going to multiply it with information assets, and then minus the risk that is mitigated by current controls. Then you add the uncertainty knowledge, that is what information you do not have. With you do this, you also give some access rights. At the end, what you're going to do, you're going to document each and everything. Now, because this risk assessment is you are also working on factual data. Factual data is you're working on facts. For some type of data, you do not have the exact information. So based upon the fact, based upon the probability of risk, your data is based upon the facts and probability. So you're going to document each and everything. This documentation, this can be done on worksheets. Now this worksheet is going to have a detailed information of the different assets that are available, what can be their impact, then what is the vulnerability, what is the vulnerability of likelihood, and then you get the risk rating factor. So this is a final table for documenting the result of the risk assessment. Here we've got the customer service request via a email. Now this is in asset. This customer service request, this is a asset. Whatever the customer has requested you, this is your asset, because you're going to provide information within the data that is stored. Then asset impact, what is the impact of the data? It is going to have some specific value. What is the vulnerability? Email disruption due to hardware failure. There can be a disruption of this email if suppose some specific hardware fails. So this is your vulnerability. Now this vulnerability, these are associated with the different threats. Now, based upon that, you identify the likelihood of vulnerability and the risk rating factor. So these all things are documented. Now, based upon this, which specific asset has got the most risk rating factor, you can focus upon that and then try to minimize the effect of risk. That can be done by making use of different risk control strategies. We're going to study the different risk control strategies so that you can decrease the amount of risk. So we've completed two things. We have done with risk identification, and today we are done with risk assessment. In the next class, we'll be dealing with the different risk control strategies. Thank you.